Welcome to Who Shaves the Barber, a weekly podcast where we discuss paradoxes, thought experiments, and other pointless problems. I'm William Nava, and today I'm with Daniel Howard. So, Daniel is, first and foremost, my best friend, which makes today a really special podcast for me to do. He's also he's first of all somebody whom I've had many conversations about many different areas of philosophy over many years. Probably the single person I've spoken to most about these kinds of topics. So these conversations have all been kind of very formative in my development in terms of my interest and also developing philosophical opinions. And then aside from just influencing me, Daniel is a fiction writer, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So first of all, welcome, Dan.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be on Who Shaves the Barber and to be talking about this. This is definitely a topic that gets me excited, so thanks for having me.
Yeah. Philosophical novels. That was the initial idea that we talked about for discussing in this episode. So let's start off there. What are the kinds of issues involved in identifying what a philosophical novel is?
Yeah, so what is a philosophical novel? Is it a novel by a philosopher who happens to write novels, or is it a novelist who happens to philosophize, right? Is it a novel in which either the narrator or the characters espouse a set of positions? Or is it a novel where either the incidents, the central metaphors, the main conceit, the characters act as metaphors that we can map onto arguments? And if a philosophical novel does exist, how can we judge it? How do we evaluate its merits? Those are some of the questions that come up with this.
Okay, so let's tackle them one by one, and let's start with the first one that you mentioned, and that is the difference between someone who's a philosopher and happens to write a novel versus somebody who's a fiction writer and happens to do some philosophy. What do you think? What are your thoughts about the difference between those two realms or similarity?
Yeah, so it's clearer now that the Academy has established departments. I take it as a sort of cultural object, and culture is more and more sharply defined in terms of how we receive these texts. If you go back prior to the establishment of the Academy as we know it, with its distinct English department and philosophy department, then you have people who practice philosophy and write novels and poetry and essays and maybe a host of other things as well, right? There's a lot more of the Renaissance man. But as the Academy starts to more and more define these things, especially as professions, right? Then the cultural object, how we receive it, becomes a little bit sharper. So when that's the case, we're looking at, was this an academic philosopher? Was it someone who primarily published philosophy and then happened to write a novel? Or was it someone who wrote novels and happened to dabble in philosophy? And there are examples of both. The latter, the novelist who happens to philosophize, one name that comes to mind is John Fowles. He's an English author of the 20th century who wrote The Magus, a great novel. Awesome. Definitely check it out. And he also wrote a short work of philosophy called The Aristos, which is a critique of Popper's open society. And then the former case, the academic philosopher, not necessarily academic and tied to a university in that sense, but someone who wrote philosophy primarily. I mean, we might say Ayn Rand fits the bill there.
As somebody who's primarily a philosopher who did fiction?
Yeah. And then there are edge cases as well. I mean, Sartre seemed, in terms of how much he published, about as interested in literature as he was in philosophy. I mean, his novel Nausea came out first, and then a couple of years later he brought out Being and Nothingness. And then from there he continued an output in both philosophy and literature. So, there's examples of all three and outliers, as well.
What do you think about somebody like Nietzsche, who wrote Thus Spoke Zarathustra? Do you consider that like almost like so much, like, do you consider something like Thus Spoke Zarathustra so philosophical that it's not even really a novel, though it happens to have that format of fiction?
I mean, that almost treads the ground of something like a mystic. He's almost going into that territory with Zarathustra. And you do have mystics who write, visions of things that are metaphorical visions of their understanding of the world and what they learned from their sort of marginal experiences of consciousness.
Actually, I love that interpretation. I feel like I never thought of it that way, but Zarathustra does read like the work of a prophet more than like a novelist or a philosopher.
That gets complicated by Nietzsche's, own playing with the irony of himself as a narrator throughout his career. There's a kind of interplay. He has, I think it's in Twilight of the Idols, where he declares himself, just the best. Sort of like, yeah, that's really almost not hyperbole at all. He just about says, I'm the best that ever was, and I'll be right about everything. And with a lot of things, he was right with his predictions. But yeah, it gets complicated because he plays with the narrator and the reliability of the narrator.
Do you think that, I don't know how much experience you have actually like reading philosophy that's written by people who are primarily fiction writers, but if you do have any, do you have any thoughts on what the quality is like? Because there's a part of me that sort of does have does want to say something like, if you're focusing most of your life on writing fiction, and then you decide, I also happen to know what's going on in the world of philosophy, let me get that out as well, that you're, I don't know, more likely than not to not be as good at it. What's your experience with that?
It is certainly that it's hard to find thinkers who are both brilliant as philosophers and brilliant as fiction writers. I mean, in the case of John Fowles, he, even in his introduction to the Aristos, says that what he has to offer is of the take it or leave it variety. He's not interested in presenting arguments so much as kind of a series of, not quite aphorisms, I don't know if that's the word, but a series of tenets of faith. And he says this is offered for you to kind of try on dogmatically. I'm not going to furnish the arguments for what I have in this book. That being said, I find what he has to say compelling in that book. It's just along traditional lines of, prove it through some combination of deduction and induction. He fails the test there. And then, on the flip side, Ayn Rand comes to mind as someone who clearly is schooled in logic and deduction and the tradition well enough that I think her philosophy should be taken seriously. And yet, I haven't read her, but the general consensus, and I don't know if this is just hostility to her, a byproduct of the hostility to her political positions, but the general consensus seems to be that her fiction is not so great. It's rare to find someone who is brilliant in both. There may be exceptions in Camus and Sartre. That's debatable for sure.
For what it's worth, I mean, for what it's worth, I have read Ayn Rand. Mostly the fiction, the philosophy, I've only read excerpts. And it's interesting that you said that the consensus about her as a fiction writer is that her work is not that great. Because certainly amongst philosophers, the consensus is that her philosophy is not that great. But there's also that question about, like, how much of that can we attribute to like automatic hostility to what her philosophical positions are, or at least like the political side of it. Though I honestly don't think that you can attribute all of it to that. Like, for example, if you think about somebody like Robert Nozick, I don't know his work super well, but I understand enough to know that his like political outcome that he proposes is, at least in the imagination of most people, a lot like the kind of political outcome that Ayn Rand is advocating for. And yet, as a philosopher, I think most philosophers will tell you, like, he's wrong about politics, but like they will still acknowledge certainly a very talented philosopher, whereas that's not the case with Ayn Rand. Anyway, I don't want to go too deep into the Ayn Rand tangent, but she is definitely a really interesting example in that she is kind of pretty prolific as an author and as a philosopher, really popular as both with certain groups, but also really hated within the elite or within like the academy or that group in both categories as well.
Well, that connects to some of the other questions that we asked initially, right? But before getting into that, just one aside that authors take a risk. Novelists take a risk when they do set forth positive positions on things, rather than favoring ambiguity and things that have become more popular. It is a risk to take a stand, and as we can get into later, I do think it's important to make some kind of positive statement with at least some of your work as a novelist. Maybe not all of it, but and there are reasons for that we can get into. But what we were talking about just now with Ayn Rand it lends itself to a discussion of another one of the questions, which is, is a philosophical novel just a metaphorical mapping onto, taking the incidents, the characters, and so on, the pieces of the novel, and can they be mapped onto arguments? And how do we evaluate those arguments that are made? And one thing that comes up there is didacticism. We definitely tend to look with distaste on novels that make didactic arguments, right?
Yeah, in the case of Ayn Rand, having read her fiction, not really her philosophy, it's part of what I personally kind of find. What turns me off a lot from her as a fiction writer is that it's very clear that her characters are standing in for virtues. Like she is absolutely, she has some very clear idea about like, this is the right way to live. So let me make this story in which, you know, the hero is somebody who has pretty much all of the things that you're supposed to live by and uses them more or less all the time. And then you have these like slightly more complicated characters who have most of the virtues, but like are like each of them is missing one like important one, and so that like accounts for their like major flaw. And then the villains, you know, are also for the most part people who are lacking like most of the virtues, although they're complicated by maybe having one or two of them. And then the major villain is like the example of, you know, of like the worst way to live. So for example, in the Fountainhead, there's this idea of being a secondhand soul, which is essentially the opposite of living selfishly. It's living entirely for other people, for the eyes of other people. And it's just so clear that the villain of that story is just, you know, it doesn't really feel like an actual person that you could ever know, and it's a person that's hard to sympathize with because he really reads just like, what would this idea of a secondhand soul look like if he was walking around and saying things?
Yeah, so that's actually a more complicated case when there's that metaphorical component, and I think it would be useful to start even simpler in the case of a text that, you know, has characters that are actually making arguments, you know, in the form of dialogue, right? And by that definition of a philosophical novel, we might include Plato's dialogues, right? And they have, some of them, in my reading of them, have that same flaw in that, you know, it follows this typical structure, right? Socrates is kind of strolling around town and, you know, accosts someone with his opinions, basically. Questions this person about an abstract term, what their definition of it is. Socrates leads his interlocutor through revisions of the definition until it reaches a contradiction. And usually the final product is something that the interlocutor wouldn't have said they believed in the first place, but just by this Socratic method of questioning the definition, it does lead to that ridiculous contradiction that's doesn't even bear resemblance to something that the person would have said they believed. But in a lot of them, you get the sense that Plato is kind of loading the dice in favor of Socrates, that Socrates is the hero, the person he's talking with is the villain, and it's just too easy for Socrates to win the argument.
I have to put in as an aside. So there's a philosopher named Michael Huemer whom actually I'll be interviewing soon, which I'm really excited about. He has on his website a humorous thing that I think he wrote, which is like different philosophers prove that P, where P stands in for whatever, some arbitrary proposition. And it's supposed to be like, whatever, humorous sort of takes on the ways that that certain philosophers argue. And the one for Plato was like in dialogue form, and Plato, and it's Socrates says P, and then you have all these other like Greek names in which they're like, yes, I think you're right, Socrates. Good point, Socrates. Just like one after the other. Anyway, I had to make that aside. Please continue.
There is one notable exception in the dialogues, and it's the Parmenides. In it, Socrates seems to be on the defensive against really strong criticism from Parmenides. Among our other arguments, Parmenides uses the famous third man argument against Socrates' theory of forms. And it's a really, really brilliant example of self-critique. It's amazing that it comes so early in the history of Western philosophy. It really stands out. I love that dialogue.
Do you think that
for precisely?
Sorry to cut you off. Do you think that for that reason, whatever the merits, let's say, of the arguments put forward in the different dialogues by Plato, that for the reason that you just explained, that the Parmenides is a particularly strong one as like a work of art, sort of as aside from its philosophical merits?
No, in that sense, the Symposium might be one of my favorites as a work of art. It's just a sort of boozy dinner among friends, and they're talking about the nature of love, and it's really the content of. In that one, it's it's not so much knock them up and Socrates line them up and Socrates will knock them down. It's more generous because some of the interlocutors are actually famous Athenians. A playwright. I think it's Aristophanes. Don't quote me on that. Giving an amazing account of different forms of love that, like some people being circles and some people being other kinds of shapes that sort of sounds like an account of different forms of sexuality, heterosexual, bisexual, and so on. It stands out as just almost like a Richard Linklater film, just a bunch of really interesting people talking about something with depth, and less like a showcase of Socrates' ability to argue.
For anybody who isn't familiar with Richard Linklater, if you've ever seen a film like Before Sunrise, it's probably the best example. Waking Life comes to mind. Slacker, Dazed and Confused, Boyhood are all movies that are, they vary a little bit in the different examples I gave, but are all movies in which essentially pretty interesting people talk to each other and have really interesting discussions, often that touch on kind of philosophical topics in a way that you would really not think would work as an entertaining film, but somehow always does. Anyway, you continue. Yeah.
So if you're asking for the best artistically, it may be, in my opinion, the Symposium. Philosophically, for the reason that I've already mentioned, as being just a tremendous example of self-critique, the Parmenides is really great.
Well, I think so. Okay, because that's interesting the way that you answered that, because I think I was kind of assuming incorrectly that you were identifying that that great example of self-critique as an example of sort of good dramatic form, but you're actually using it more as a good example of good philosophical form. And I asked, putting the philosophical views aside, but I think what's an interesting distinction comes up here, which is the distinction between how strong is a philosophical view or philosophical position just in virtue of how right it is or how accurate it is, or how influential it is, let's say, versus how well presented is some philosophical position in how it's being put forth in some particular work. So maybe the Parmenides is a work where most of the positions presented by Socrates or by Parmenides or both are not particularly compelling. But what you're describing is good sort of philosophical craft in terms of expounding a position, it sounds like.
Yeah, and that will actually connect to something that we should probably save for later, which is that, some background about me and my philosophical outlook. I tend to be very relativistic in a lot of respects. And so I look to philosophy and to literature as sort of for edification, more as triggers for a certain kind of experience for consciousness to go through, rather than giving us the correct answers.
So you're one of the evil English department people that is relativizing philosophy and making it dirty.
I'm glad to be included in that ilk.
So I do want to get back to that, because I want to ask you a little bit more about this, because honestly, I mean, in so much philosophy that I read, that I read, relativism is put forth almost as like an ad hominem. So I'm interested in going down that road. But I think it's right that we should probably save that a little bit for later. Going back a little bit to the idea of philosophical novels, one thing that I encounter sometimes explicitly, more often than not, I kind of just pick it up implicitly, is that the philosopher is a kind of scientist, broadly speaking, by which I think the idea is that the philosopher's job is to discover. And I like to think, sometimes I think of there being this dichotomy, or maybe just spectrum, let's say, between discovery and creation as being a useful way to think about some things. And that the philosopher is supposed to be among the discoverers. And so that if you had a philosopher who was also a scientist, or also a mathematician, or also working in this kind of discovery field, maybe also a linguist or whatever, that would be sort of less surprising or more in line with what we assume. Whereas having a philosopher who's also an artist of some kind would seem to be a little bit less natural. Now, I'm not saying that I agree with that. Actually, I pretty actively don't agree with that. I think that the kind of creative role of the philosopher, even like the contemporary analytic philosopher, is kind of undervalued and underappreciated. But the reason I'm bringing all this up is that I'm curious to hear your thoughts about what about the sort of faculties or the craft of being a writer has affinity with the faculty or involved in or the craft of being a philosopher. Like, what about being either of those two might actually lend itself to using, to being good at both?
Well, to start off, what we might say about the philosopher, I think, is equally applicable to the scientist, right? In different ways, but so for the philosopher, you have to subject your argument, all of its premises, to the pressures exerted on it by a counter argument. And that process is called dialectic, right? So dialectic is, just taking your argument and coming up with the strongest possible objection to each step of it. And
that's kind of what you were just praising Plato for doing in the Parmenides.
Exactly, yeah. So each step along the way, coming up with the best possible objection, the strongest, and then refuting that, right? And then you can run that process recursively on your own refutations to the objections, right? So every time you reject, then there's a counter argument to your objection. And you can, you could say that to do that really thoroughly requires a creative faculty. And here's how. You have to step outside of your own point of view and question it. And that, I say that that's creative because that's almost like being an actor. That's almost like really becoming someone else, to think of what someone else who has no investment in believing what you have to say would say in objection to it, right? And I think that that's very creative. Also, in a lot more contemporary philosophy, it's not only in contemporary philosophy, but I think it's, I don't know, maybe you can weigh in on this. It's become more popular to pose thought experiments. And I think thought experiments are very, very close to fiction writing. And there are even some elements of certain kind of fiction writers that they're little set pieces that are almost like thought experiments inside of a work of fiction. And that's creative because, you make an argument very concrete. I'm wondering about, Descartes has the thought experiment of the demon, he's uncertain of everything, and he could just be, there could just be an evil demon that's tricking him about everything that he thinks he's certain of. Look at that side by side with the Matrix, right? In the Matrix, you have a main character who sort of questions everything, and it's revealed to him that, oh yeah, there is this artificial reality that I've been relating to the whole time as if it were what's real, and it turns out it's not. That's just a sort of, making Descartes' method into a story, with further complications through the plot and the development of the character Neo. But yeah, you can see how both activities are related, and they probably draw on the same skill set. As far as the fiction writer drawing on skills or faculties that the philosopher uses, I think that in that case we need to take the idea of the philosophical novel as one in which there are characters who directly argue for things. Take that 1 degree removed, metaphorically, to where instead of having characters directly expressing opinions and arguments, you have metaphorical stand-ins. And that can be anything, really anything in the novel. It can be the setting. It can be the characters. It can be the character's choices. It can be the forces of antagonism that meet the character throughout the story. As soon as we take that metaphorical step, it's kind of like an act of translation. You have to translate the abstract into the concrete. And I think that that's one of the major skills of a novelist who writes philosophical novels.
I wanted to ask you this. To what extent do you think that a novelist, when coming up with characters and setting and situations and all of this, actually has in mind something like a philosophical position, or at least a set of possible, like a set of philosophical positions and how they might relate to each other in mind? Because when you're talking about this, one of the things that comes to mind is that a philosopher who comes up with a thought experiment is usually already has a position in mind and some idea about maybe how some positions relate to each other. And then, maybe it wants to communicate this clearly, and so thinks of like, okay, maybe, let me try to think of a scenario where this will come out. Do you think that there's any similarity in like your typical novelist's process?
I think the answer is no for most novelists. And the reason there is that philosophy and novels, they have a different purpose for communication. Philosophy, at least prior to most of what we might call like a relativizing revolution that happened toward the late 19th century, early 20th century. Right? Prior to that, philosophy was out to answer questions, and it believed it could. Right? And so that's a completely different enterprise than the novelist, who may think they're onto something, but to present it as straightforwardly as, well, I know what the deal is with the world, and here, let me tell you. That would probably result in just the sort of novel we were saying would ring as didactic.
Don't you think that? So it seems to me, and I could totally just be totally wrong here, but it just seems to me that the difference there is that a good novelist knows not to be didactic, that smells false, and that, first of all, you won't convince people by being didactic because they'll be turned off by the fact that they're being didactic, but also they have a genuine care for the craft. Maybe that's even primary to them, and so the craft doesn't feel right to them if they're being didactic, and so they don't want to do that, and so they really, really complicate it and make it as true to life as possible. But that nonetheless, there is a kind of putting forward a particular worldview from, I want to say, many great novelists that seems important and intentional, and it is a particular worldview that they're giving you, even though it's very complex. So, I think this is an interesting case of a philosophical novelist is Dostoevsky. So, when I read almost any Dostoevsky, so I've read Notes from Underground, Demons, Brothers Karamazov, and Crime and Punishment, and I really love all four of them. All of them give me a sense that Dostoevsky is trying to tell me something. He's never going to make it simple. He's always going to go back and forth in a lot of different ways. But at the end of it, I feel like he's got a particular worldview, and in a very, very, very complicated way, he's trying to convince me of it.
I think so. There's the question of intention, right? And what's remarkable, part of why we love novels is some of the best works, right? And not just with novels, but the works of Shakespeare, Dante, people who have just been cherished throughout the ages, right? They just don't go away. It's kind of like they have this infinite reinterpretability. We can always read them in light of our current context in history, right? Not just that, but even if, in the author's eyes, in terms of their intention, the work is paraphrasable to some little aphoristic nugget, right? Even if they believe that, what's beautiful is that they can't force that on the reader. The only, they can do that by being heavy-handed and didactic, so they're probably going to turn off readers if they do that, so they avoid it, right? And by avoiding it, what they have to offer, it may make its gestures to try and push us toward the interpretation that they favor. But these are metaphors. And so, taken metaphorically in the minds of readers with vastly different experiences of life, it's always going to be interpreted differently.
So I think what you're saying makes sense. I'm interested in the case. Even though it's not that important to the value of a novel, I am interested in the author's interpretation. So, for example, you mentioned Shakespeare, and I know very little about Shakespeare's life or his views. I've just read a couple of his plays. But to give an example, when I read Hamlet, So Hamlet is something that's like particularly well known for its like infinite interpretability, right? When I read Hamlet, I don't get the sense that he's trying to tell me something. I can, I could maybe pick out an interpretation that I think fits best what the story tells, and maybe I can get like attached to that interpretation and tell you this is my preferred interpretation of Hamlet. But I don't feel like, I guess I feel like Shakespeare wanted to create something with a wide variety of interpretations, and he succeeded at that. Whereas Dostoevsky, I think, is also somebody whose work lends itself to a great deal of interpretation. So Brothers Karamazov, you could interpret that a million different ways. But nonetheless, there's a different sense in which I feel like, like he was, like he had a particular one that he hoped, might get across. I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
So there might be some difference there in terms of the kind of ancillary evidence that's used for interpretations. You may not have read it, but it may have, like let's say you flip through an introduction by some scholar in the translation that you have, right? Or you read the Wikipedia page, or, just in conversation with other people who have ingested those other ancillary pieces of evidence. They all draw on, things like journals and letters that in the case of Dostoevsky, they're available to us, whereas with Shakespeare, they're not. And so I think an interesting case alongside Shakespeare is Dante. If we agree with you about the sort of feeling that you get from Shakespeare, that he's not necessarily trying to tell you something, and yet he's given us a rich narrative in which we're led to even consider, all kinds of points of view. Dante, I think, through just how tightly he adhered to an allegory throughout the Divine Comedy, seems to suggest that he was really after communicating something a bit more directly, right? And yet, there's just as much infinite reinterpretability. I mean, you can look at all the scholarly papers. There's a lot of people, a lot of forests have been taken down by people writing about Dante, just about as much as Shakespeare,
Yeah. I wish I could compare my like instinctive feeling about whether Dante is trying to tell us something, but I have not read Dante. Okay, I want to move on to another topic that we kind of touched on, and it's this. So you mentioned as a kind of similarity between the process of doing philosophy and the process of doing fiction, the dialectical process, right? So as a philosopher, you come up with a position, and then what do? You try to subject it to objections by putting your sort of mind, kind of pretending to be somebody who's sort of committed to shooting down your objection, and then you repeat that and do it kind of recursively. And you also said that, that's a lot what you have to do as a novelist as well, right? You have your protagonist, and presumably you want to do that to your protagonist as well for a good drama. You want the forces of antagonism to be as strong as possible in order to test the protagonist's character and whatever desire for whatever the goal might be. And I find that to be extremely interesting, that connection between like a novel's protagonist and a philosopher's thesis, let's say, and how they both have to go, subjected to these analogous processes of subjecting to antagonisms / objections. Do you think there's something? I mean, and I don't know how to put this question. Like, do you think there's something interesting philosophically to be inferred from the fact that the two practices practices share that structure?
Yeah, so it's interesting. They're both dialectical. In the case of writing fiction, we mean that in a Hegelian sense. And, what do I mean by that? Hegel, right, the German philosopher, had this idea of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And I don't want to get much further into it than that. Just with that, we can look at the fiction writer as dealing with contradictions inherent in everything that we believe and using metaphor to have and hold in mind at the same time either end of the contradiction, the thesis and the antithesis, right? What is it like to truly believe and not believe something at the same time? And where might that lead us? What we get, and this actually goes back a little bit to some of your questions on process, I don't think that the writer goes into it knowing that, they have the answer to a particular question or even what the question is. It's really discovery through what I think is a very dialectical process. You might even call it organic as well. Organic in the sense that it's just almost like the way cells replicate. It's like they carry out a procedure recursively again and again, and a simple thing goes from being simple to complex by the end of just carrying on this process recursively. And so what is that process? It's a character with a strong desire being subjected to the forces of antagonism. And we judge a novel to be, at least one within the traditional mode, we judge it to be, it's better if every step of the way the choices get harder. And how do we do that? We make the forces of antagonism harder, more difficult to surmount. How do we do that? We make the choices themselves require more and more risk and sacrifice. And some of the best story turning points involve risking something that they held dear at the beginning of the story, being willing to sacrifice that in exchange for some new value that has emerged throughout the struggle. And that new value, you might say, is often the synthesis.
And we're back. You cut out a bit at the end there, but I think I got most of what you said. I find it interesting in this particular topic that for the writer and the philosopher, the process is one of facing up against a kind of contradiction of whatever it is that you're starting with. So for the writer, it's the protagonist's desire, and then for the philosopher, it's this position. That the process so centralizes on trying to find these contradictions that will kind of annihilate the thing that you're putting forward, right? And that in this process of trying to find this contradiction that kind of annihilates is actually where the growth comes from, right? So for a protagonist, I feel like that is the idea for how a protagonist is supposed to grow and develop character, right? That you face up, and well, not just for character, but I think this is also an idea that we have just about people, right? That you face adversity, and the greater the adversity up to a certain point, right? The more you kind of grow out of facing it. And so that this idea that something should actually be annihilating you, canceling you out, is actually giving you this opportunity for growth. And it seems to me that that's a good model for how characters in fiction develop as well. And the same goes for philosophy, right? Like, if you have a position, regardless of how accurate or not it happens to be, its strength as an actual philosophical position is going to come from the strength of the things that the objections that you subject it to, and how it's able to fare and develop in light of those objections. And I find that similarity very interesting. I think that you're right that it's, broadly Hegelian. I mean, you said that it's Hegelian in the case of the fiction. I think maybe a lot of people would really want to push back on saying that the philosophical process is necessarily Hegelian, but given that Hegel was somebody who, as far as I can tell, without knowing his work very well, did think that from contradiction emerged growth, development, and change. There's something about that seems to fit.
I think it's really appealing, and it seems to be true in the lives of some philosophers. I know that William James went through a depression early in life. It seemed like he was just thinking so hard about these things, like free will in particular, that they were of tremendous import, and he took them really seriously. He took the implications of them for his life very, very seriously, to the point that it made him feel mentally unwell that he didn't have a solution to it. And then he resolves it, and I forget the name of it, but he has a paper on free will where he said he just kind of had to take that step of faith. So a process-oriented way of thinking about how we reach our conclusions is useful, and I think it goes back to that idea of the process being edifying, not necessarily one of discovery and finding the correct answers, but finding the process of going through the process to reach whatever answer we might offer is therapeutic and edifying.
So, in the time that we have left, I do want to get into this idea about that you have about relativized thinking and how that informs what novelists should do. So let's start with, you said that you yourself have a kind of relativistic disposition. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, so I sort of begin with radical skepticism, and I don't see much that convinces me of how you can answer something like Lewis Carroll's little piece on Achilles and the tortoise, right? If you have a rule of logic or an axiom of logic, if A, let's call it A, if B, then C, proposition A is, if A, then you can deduce some other thing. I'm not convinced by just taking that for granted. I feel like there's a burden of proof to say why we believe in those axioms, why we think those rules function things.
Another way that
govern things.
Another way that this has been put that I'm really interested in is in the Agrippin trilemma, which is this idea that if knowledge is supposed to require some kind of justification for that knowledge, then you immediately have a regress problem, which is that, let's say that you believe X, you're justified in feeling that you know X because you know Y, and Y justifies X. Like, okay, well then what justifies you in believing that Y? Well, Z justifies that Y, and I believe I know that Z. And you're gonna have to keep doing that. And so the Agrippan trilemma says, look, if you want to avoid skepticism, you're going to need to either believe that an infinite chain of justification is somehow justification, which seems really counterintuitive to most people. Although there's one guy named Peter Klein who's kind of famous for defending that view, and I'm going to be interviewing him as well. I'm really excited to talk to him. So either that, or there's the coherentist view, which is like, okay, X justifies Y and Y justifies X. And so you're like in a loop of justification. But that also seems like it's ungrounded. All you have is like a loop, but what like holds up the loop? And then you have the most popular response, which is foundationalism, which is to say there's going to be something that you get to that you don't need another one to justify. But that seems really difficult to account for. How then that counts as knowledge? Like, how is it that you get to call something knowledge without it requiring some other piece of justification? And this way of looking at it, I think, is really hard to get beyond, and is, I think, actually a really great case itself for, well, the fourth option, which is to accept some form of skepticism.
Yeah, and so I think the Agrippan trilemma gets to the same thing that I was speaking about, which is this infinite regress problem of justification, and that's really the heart of it.
Well, if I'm not sure where you were going with this, but I don't want you to go on to like the relationship to novels yet, because what I want to ask is that as strong as the Agrippan trilemma is, and this is to me the heart of epistemology, and I find it to be very interesting, as difficult as it is to get past the Agrippan trilemma, which might make you tempted by skepticism, there's also a really serious problem with skepticism, and that is that it seems to be self-defeating, right? Like if you believe in skepticism, that is that you don't have grounds for knowledge, then whatever it is that leads you to think that is something that you should also think you don't have grounds for believing. So the idea is the position to kind of destroys itself.
That's sort of exactly where I was headed. If you're playing the game of absolute knowledge, then my response is skepticism. But I totally accept playing a sort of sub-game where we acknowledge that, all right, in terms of absolute answers to these questions, we're going to be agnostic. If we accept that, then we can play this sub-game using the traditional vocabularies that have been developed, right? And inside of that, I'm more comfortable talking, in scientific terms or things like that. It's just that behind that, I'm saying, well, not absolutely. I mean, I'm agnostic on answering this absolutely.
So you think so you believe in a kind of like provisional knowledge that allows you to sort of behave and think as if you do have actual beliefs, but that that it's fundamentally kind of provisional because of the skeptical problem?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I think I believe something very similar. That's why one thing I'm really interested in at the moment is whether there's problems like the problems with skepticism, with just fallibilism, with just the idea that, like, yes, there is knowledge, but none of it is actually certain. I don't know if any. I'm not sure if there. I'm very interested to see whether the similar kinds of like self-defeating problems that like are that hurt skepticism would also hurt that. But I don't want to go too deeply into that. So going off from the skepticism that you've described, how does that get you to relativism, and what do you mean by relativism?
Well, within the traditional vocabularies, it's kind of like those set the priorities of any discourse that we're saying we're going to take part in. And those vocabularies are contingent, historically contingent. They've been constructed by people. And I looked at things like the work of Thomas Kuhn on, the different paradigms, right, in science, and how something like the Newtonian paradigm was displaced by quantum mechanics. I looked at things like that as, how we're just evolving the tools with which we describe things. And that evolution is just a contingent evolution of different kinds of vocabularies. So for that reason, and this is really me being very well convinced by some of Rorty's arguments in Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity. I'm a huge fan of that work. And at least the section on epistemology. I'm pretty well convinced of the idea that these are contingent vocabularies. And if we're playing the game of science according to the predominant vocabulary, then we can have those kind of provisional answers to things. And I think they're useful. It's helpful to be pragmatic about it and not search for absolute answers. In fact, those probably don't exist. And so we can content ourselves with the most useful answers that we can come up with.
So for you then, relativism is what your beliefs are relative to. When you say that you are kind of relativistic in your thinking, is that it's relative to certain vocabularies, like certain types of discourse.
Yeah, and each of those has a priority. So science seems to prioritize predictive power, right? Its ability to predict things. If you take some kind of stimuli and you bounce it off the world, what is the world going to bounce back with the highest degree of probability? So that's one way of evaluating truth. But that's one among many possible vocabularies. For some people, it trumps all other vocabularies by virtue of that predictive power. I'm not as sure about that.
What are your thoughts on, is there a problem with this approach? This is something I've asked myself about Rorty's work quite a bit, and I don't know if I have an answer myself. And that is there a problem in talking about this type of stuff in the sense that it presumes that we can have this kind of meta vocabulary about vocabularies, so like the scientific vocabulary is about, like you said, predictive power and the way that, and it has its favored objects, which are elementary particles and forces and what have you. And maybe there's like ethics talk, which has things like moral responsibility and agents and trolleys. Doesn't it seem like talking the way that Rorty does presupposes that we can have something like the vocabulary where we can have this sort of high-on view and talk about the ways that vocabularies relate to each other?
I do think it's possible to have that kind of vocabulary, not necessarily for evaluating them. just to describe them, I think that that's possible, but evaluating them, I think, will ultimately run into presupposing some of the values of one of the vocabularies it's supposed to be evaluating.
Right. Yeah, I guess in order to evaluate between different vocabularies, it has to presume some kind of system of value judgment, and it can't really justify that system, whichever one it happens to use, outside of just the fact that it happens to be the one adopted by this particular vocabulary, which even if it's like a meta vocabulary, still doesn't allow it to kind of like, I don't know, penetrate the other vocabularies and like go, speak over them, if that makes sense. I'm speaking metaphorically now, but I hope that makes sense.
It does, and I mean a large part of what Rorty, with not just CIS but his other output, was out to do was kind of criticize the effort since Kant to sort of like be the referees of what counts as legitimate philosophy. The very meta vocabulary you were talking about is sort of what Kant was after.
Right.
An evaluative vocabulary that could act as the judge for the rest of culture. That's a valid science. That's an invalid science. That's kind of the role Kant wanted philosophy to play.
Yeah. I think also very related to this is just the insight that any kind of claim that you want to make has to be embedded within some language. And going back to what you said before, there's certain limitations that languages have. They're contingent, and they have to have some kind of, let's say at least grammatical form, which will leave out certain possibilities, which already seems to suggest the impossibility of the one true language that rules over them all. So I already kind of asked you this about the self-defeat problem with skepticism, but I'm going to ask it again with regard to relativism, just because I think it's so commonly the thing that comes to mind when people take issue with relativism. So I think how we got from skepticism to this relativism where things are relative to vocabularies makes sense. How do you deal with if you acknowledge that there's a sense in which your claims or beliefs are relative to whatever vocabulary you happen to be working with, how do you avoid that being just in a kind of quagmire where you never have true justification? Because let's say you're in a discussion with somebody and then they say, well, I just don't want to adopt your vocabulary. Like, isn't that just why isn't that just a game stopper?
I don't think it's a game stopper because we can bring about experiences that lead people to change. I think the force of, what's behind the force of persuasion is not what we thought it was. It's not deductive proof or inductive proof. That's not what is convincing people or changing their minds. I think, and this is probably very controversial, so I would take a lot of crap for it, I think. But I think it's more like what we mean when we say brainwashing. It's brainwashing people because your views seem to cohere with your behavior in an attractive way. Basically it has led to consequences that seem attractive to us. And I think if one really looks hard at their intellectual development, they'll see this sort of attraction phenomenon going on. If they kind of psychoanalyze themselves about how they've come to believe the things that they believe, I think there's a lot of basis in your, the contingencies that make up your autobiography, and if you probe deeply enough into them, you'll see that you are sort of ripe to believe just the very sorts of things you believe based on exposure throughout your life to different kinds of stimuli that exerted this influence over you. And again, just to hammer it home, it's usually an influence of something seeming very attractive about some set of beliefs. And you know, to a greater or lesser degree in different types of people based on their personalities, you know, convince themselves that it was caused by some great arguments, when really I think it was just a kind of brainwashing.
So, last question on this, and then I want to move on to the novels. How does having this view about how we come to attain the views that we have affect you in terms of your credence of your own views? So, you know, presumably, and I think this is again another version of that same problem of self-defeat, right? Like, presumably, everything that you just described, if it's accurate, describes how you came to that view itself. If you agree with that, why doesn't that make you sort of lose a bit of belief in that view itself?
It has to do with the priorities for myself and my life. I rely more and more on intuition to guide that, and I'm actually okay, because it's kind of like in staking that original ground, you know, kind of saying, all right, absolutely, we can't know, I'm agnostic. Then I can play this game, usually by ear, you know, by intuition, listening for what seems like it would lead me to the best consequences, the best version of life that I can have for myself. That's the priority. And so I listen to and adhere to the kinds of vocabularies and the propositions that those put forward that seem likely to lead me to having a good life.
It sounds almost like going through all of these thoughts has led you to a view of the rational process in which you acknowledge that there's something about it that's kind of self-defeating. And so you have now tended to use other faculties such as intuition in order to guide your beliefs. And you keep in mind this rational process and the way that it's self-defeating. And that makes it so that most, like all of your beliefs, have that provisional character, but you're still able to move forward and have beliefs because you're using these other faculties like intuition.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. I'm glad we were able to kind of get that out as about relativism, because it's, I don't know, I find it an interesting topic, and it's also very charged for a lot of people. So let me now ask you then, how does this relate to your view of what novelists do and maybe what they should do?
So novelists can get a lot of criticism for bucking the relativizing trend. What do we mean by the relativizing trend? It's just the preponderance of, in the early 20th century, a bunch of things from a bunch of different quarters, so kind of throwing large doubts on some things that were taken for granted. Like Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, Gödel's incompleteness theorem, the work of Einstein. The World War I. There were a lot of things that made humanity in general question some of the big conceptions of how the world worked. Science started to go from being like a jigsaw puzzle model where we're contributing pieces of the puzzle that Newton's set up. And, one day, once we get the final piece in there, we'll be able to explain everything from the Big Bang onward, everything neatly and tidily theorized. And the same thing in mathematics. You had Bertrand Russell and Whitehead working on the Principia Mathematica, which tried to formalize all of logic. And Gödel dismantles that in one fell swoop. So you have these big verities that totally get undermined. And then it translates into a cultural trend of people really appreciating a degree of relativizing in things like the arts. And so, fast forward to the 70s and you get a writer like the American John Gardner, who wrote On Moral Fiction. He landed himself in a firestorm of criticism for, he took a lot of pot shots at his contemporaries, and that, he was kind of talking crap about every major writer, so I could see why he got into some hot water. But then also for the views themselves, which some saw as a very didactic moralism. So there's a risk involved with coming out and saying, we should try to put forward positive propositions about, life and how people should act. And there's a risk involved.
You mean the social risk because of the climate of... Yeah.
There's a risk to the writer's reputation and livelihood, possibly, if it's bad enough, if the backlash is bad enough. So, I definitely, I don't think that a writer should do this necessarily with all of their work. But in some pieces, I think they should try and put forward positive statements for two reasons. One is more negative and critical, and the other is positive. So there's a kind of cowardice to never taking that risk, and always relativizing things, because we live in a world where that hasn't caught up to everybody. That relativizing trend hasn't caught up to, your average Philistine. It's definitely taking hold of the minds of a lot of people. But there's a sizable portion of the world's population that still holds absolutist views. And so you might be negligent not to take a stand, because somebody who does have some pretty absolutist views might lead the way and take us down a road that's very violent, possibly fascistic. And it might be dangerous to never state things, make a positive statement about what you believe, to always, relativize things so that you cover your bases and you can pass the aesthetic test of the dominant fashion. The more positive reason is that, it kind of goes back to this difference between philosophy and narrative, that, philosophy also changed with this relativizing trend. You have philosophers who start to argue for the impossibility of eternal answers to things. But you still have a lot of philosophy that believes in that project, and is advancing it forward. Novels, on the other hand, they don't purport to have definitive answers, right? So we know to take it as a provisional answer. We know that, here's a worldview that we can try on for size, right? I think that there's a benefit to novelists putting that out there and trying to, avoid being didactic and yet still get someone to really have the experience of what it would be like to take on that worldview. Because even if it doesn't convince the person, in my sense of convincing, brainwashing them into being an adherent of that worldview, I think it could be part of that dialectical process for that reader. It could be just one exposure to the antithesis that will then result in that person reaching a synthesis. And that would probably be greater than what they would reach on their own, never being exposed to a very strong statement of something that is in contradiction to what they already believe. So again, it goes back to this idea of, really looking to philosophy and fiction for therapeutic and edifying experiences and being triggers for those experiences.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It sounds like, well, there's a lot in what you just said. One thing is that what I kind of take from it is if you're a philosopher and your primary objective is I just want to state the truth as accurately as possible, that's my only intention, then maybe what you're saying might suggest to that philosopher to be making a kind of case for relativism. But if you're a novelist, your job is much more complex than just stating a particular point of view, certainly more complex than like just stating what you think is the true point of view. And so even if you happen to be a novelist that is convinced by relativism, that doesn't mean that you should be trying to like constantly have your novels match a kind of relativistic worldview. It also sounds like you're thinking of the novelist, whereas we were talking earlier about this dialectical process and like, subject your protagonist to forces of antagonism and subject your position to counter arguments. You're now talking about the novelist as, as opposed to doing that within one novel, having your whole novel being one part of that, right? So, and letting the dialectical process and that kind of like contradiction process happening in the broader sphere of just the community of fiction writers.
Yeah, I think, a good example of a philosophical novel that, could, let's say, fall into the hands of a Christian or someone who's a believer, right, is The Stranger. And so The Stranger could fall into that reader's hands and function as just a part, the antithesis part of this dialectical process, and be a trigger for reaching an affirmation of their belief in a new qualified way through this synthesis. I can imagine that as a very powerful experience for a believer. Equally powerful would be reading The Stranger by Camus as exposure to a thesis that triggers some kind of reaction against it and yet reaches some sort of synthesis. I think that The Stranger does a very good job of, it's less a case of the conflict sort of acting as metaphorical stand-ins for pieces of an argument. I mean, it does a bit of that, for sure. It's less that than it seems like trying to give the reader the experience of reaching the conclusion that the protagonist reaches. It does a damn good job of that, I think.
Yeah. I'm reminded I once, when I was working in a restaurant, saw a woman reading The Sickness Unto Death by Kierkegaard. And I asked her a little bit about it. And she said that she was a Christian whose belief in God mattered a lot to her, but that she was having doubts, and that so she was just like engaging literature as like part of exploring that. And I was just like, you're amazing. What a like genuine thing to be doing. I wanted to make one more sort of observation about some of what you said, and I wonder if you agree with it. And that is that if you're really a relativist, I think you have to accept that self-defeating aspect of relativism and kind of come to terms with it in a way that I think that you have. And, I think that part of that is really acknowledging fully that there's no way you can really undercut the validity of another point of view, including another point of view that isn't relativistic. And so, to me, that suggests, especially if you're a novelist, which means that part of your job really is inhabiting other people's points of views, that as a relativistic novelist, it's like actually philosophically, it seems to really make sense that you should be rather compelled to, not compelled like you really have to, but like it seems to really, there's something really suggestive about the idea that it should seem appealing to you to make novels that really genuinely propose points of view that are kind of absolutist, and not necessarily because you believe in them, but because doing that is actually in this weird meta way kind of consistent with your own relativistic worldview.
I think there's an interesting example of that in Alain Robbe-Grillet. He's a French novelist I think he started in the 1950s. And carried on from there. Died relatively recently. So he was a novelist and a theorist of the novel. He's responsible in some of his theoretical essays on fiction for starting the French movement of the Nouveau Roman, which just means the new novel. He does not believe in the correspondence theory of truth. So language cannot connect up to objects, right? And so he has a couple of essays about how that seemed to really be a source of disappointment to a lot of people. The kind of existential dread about us not being able to find eternal answers and being totally stuck with contingency. He questions that attitude in response to it. Like, we can still accept that that's so, but we don't have to take that response. And so his work is interesting in how it deals with that. He writes what sounds like very, very objective, and I'm using scare quotes, descriptions. Geometric descriptions. He'll talk about the like an angle coming from the southwest, and he'll give you the exact kind of geometric shape that an object is, even if it's a rare one. He has a novel where the narrator is kind of absent throughout, and that absence becomes a presence. It's a jealous husband who is never mentioned as the narrator. And so there are very, very precise descriptions of where an observer could look from. It can be seen from this angle, that sort of thing, right? And you get the sense more and more that we're really getting an objective telling of these scenes between a woman and her lover. She's having an extramarital affair. That's a really good example of what he does. It's objectivity raised to such a scientific degree, and he was actually, the author Robbe-Grillet was actually a scientist as well, raised to such a degree of scientific description to fool you into thinking that it's objective. And yet, you do get that gnawing sense in this one novel called Jealousy. You get the sense of this absent character, the husband. He's just a dominating presence, even though he's never mentioned, because of just how much he avoids talking about a narrator. It's always, this scene could be seen from this angle. Someone could watch from this window the unfolding of these happenings. Because he keeps on making those kinds of gestures, the husband is just a oppressive presence there, even though he's never mentioned. And so that, in combination with this objective language, really questions the possibility of that objective language. And so, it's an example of just what you were talking about, taking on such an absolutist view and with a bit of irony, completely undermining it.
All right, man. I think that's as good a place as any to call this one done. Thank you so much. This has been a really, really awesome discussion. Just another great conversation with Daniel Howard for me, but I'm curious to see what people will make of it.
Well, thanks a lot for having me. It was fun.
And that concludes today's episode of Who Shaves the Barber? Again, I'm William Nava. You can check out other episodes, as well as my other philosophical and artistic work at williamnava.com. And if you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, go to williamnava.podbean.com. Thank you so much for listening.